Welcome to Read with Maren. In our last video, Joe and Grandma found the oldest settler, and Mary Alice is up to something. The end of A Long Way from Chicago, coming up next. Let's begin. On the first day of the Centennial celebration, the town began to fill up with merrymakers and the curious. People came in farm wagons and Fords from as far away as Bemet and Tuscola. Grandma closed all her windows because the dust from the road never settled. People came for the events, the tree topping and chicken plucking competitions, and the chili cook-off. They marveled at the flower show put on by the ladies of the United Brethren Church and the mother and daughter look-alike contest, the spelling bee, the Illinois Power and Light Company's display on rural electrification, and the three-legged race. I hadn't seen hide nor hoofmark of Mary Alice all day. That evening, Grandma and I had a quiet supper at the kitchen table, under the ceiling light and the flypaper strips. This was the night of the talent show. I knew we were going, even after she poured a second cup of coffee and stifled a yawn like she was thinking of bed. "Well, I guess you'll want to look in on the show," she remarked. But I was 15 now, and wise to her. I stifled a yawn. "Doesn't matter to me." "Well, we don't have to stay to the end." She was on her feet now, making short work of the dishes. The stage was a bandstand in the park, lit with headlights running off car batteries. We chose a back bench because nobody wanted to sit behind Grandma. And we could see everybody from here. The audience was mostly town people because the farmers had all gone home to do their chores. But there was a good turnout. Mr. and Mrs. L.J. Weidenbach were up in the front row. On a table by the bandstand waited the loving cup for first prize and scrolls for second, third, and honorable mention. Just as the crowd was getting restless, the first act began. A man playing the musical saw. Grandma sat through that with both hands clamped on her knees. Afterward, she remarked that it had been more saw than music. Then we had a barbershop quartet. Though they called themselves the Son of the Prairie Pioneers and all wore beards, they were Mr. Earl T. Askew and 3 more of the sheriff's deputies. Practice had improved them some, and they didn't sing the night that Patty Murphy died in mixed company. They did a melody that included Just a Song at Twilight, and after a round of applause came back for Sweet Adeline. Grandma wasn't about to clap for deputies. She began to fidget. The vocal part of the program continued with the choir from Miss Effie Wilcox's church. They did Sweet Hour of Prayer, the Old Rugged Cross, and I Came to the Garden Alone While the Dew is Still on the Roses. These got no response from the United Brethren members. But the choir returned for an encore anyway, with tambourines to sing Sing Low, Sweet Chariot, and Scoop Me Up from the Mire, Take Me Up to Glory, Snatched from Eternal Fire. If I hadn't known better, I'd have thought Grandma was ready to leave. She was fidgeting all over the bench. Then a boy clumped on stage. He was about 5th grade or an overgrown 4th. His hair was parted in the middle, and he had painted artificial freckles all over his moon face. His costume was high-top shoes and old-time breeches held up by one suspender. "That's my nephew, everybody!" Miss L.J. Weidenbach called out from the front row. He cleared his throat and began to recite. "Ain't I glad I ain't a girl, hands to wash and hair to curl, skirts a-flapping round my knees, ain't I glad that ain't me?" The boy planted his fist on his pudgy hips and looked over at the audience. "Grandpa says it's just a chance that I got to wearing pants. Says that when a kid is small, they put dresses on 'em all. They that kicks and makes a noise gets promoted into boys. Them that sits and twists their curls, they just leaves them, calls 'em girls." He took his bow to a spatter of applause that grew. All of Mrs. Weidenbach's friends stood to clap, and they were joined by everybody that owed the bank money. The boy kept bowing. "That made me about half sick," Grandma remarked. At this point, we could have used an intermission, but Miss Merle Stubbs of the Ladies' Committee mounted the stage, carrying a portable Victrola. She threw wide its doors and wound it up. "Crank it up, Lula!" somebody called out, and the crowd tittered. Miss Stubbs dropped a record on the turntable and withdrew. They'd have dimmed the lights now, but the car batteries were weakening anyway. Music from a full orchestra welled out of the Victrola. It was a waltz. "When I grow too old to dream, I'll have you to remember." From nowhere, a couple glided into the bandstand stage. He was tall, dark, and handsome, and seemed to be wearing a tuxedo. In his big hands, he held a girl, the vision of a girl. Headlights caught the glimmer of her white gown as he twirled her in easy circles. Her graceful hand held up her flowing skirts. The crowd caught its breath. It was like a movie coming to life. The seed pearls on the girl's dress flashed pale fire. I looked again, and behind the careful makeup, below the swooped-up hair, it was Mary Alice. As she turned in the waltz, a bustle came into view. I nudged Grandma hard, but she was completely caught up in the sight of Mary Alice, sweeping around the stage in Grandma's own wedding dress. But who was her partner? He was dipping her almost to the floor now, and you couldn't tell who was leading who. I squinted and saw that it was Ray Veach. Ray Veach, of Veach's Gas and Oil, and wearing Grandpa Dowdel's wedding suit with the cuffs let all the way down. Ray Veach, a man's man, who spent his life under cars with grease up to his elbows. Ray Veach and Mary Alice. My world tilted. Now the waltz was winding down, and Ray and Mary Alice came out even with it. Still clinging to one of his big hands, she collapsed to the floor in an elegant curtsy. Her skirts fanned out in every direction. After a moment of stunned silence, the crowd was on its feet. They were getting up on their benches and clapping over their heads in applause like summer thunder. Grandma stood. Patting her back hair in a satisfied way, she said, "We don't need to stay to the end." We were up way before daybreak on Saturday. While the dew was still on the roses, the road outside Grandma's house was thronged with people coming in from as far away now as Argenta and Farmer City for the parade. But we were working right up to the last minute on our float. At the stroke of 11, the parade stepped off with the high school bands of the 3 nearest towns with high schools. Next, in the order of procession, were 5 tractor-drawn hay frames jammed with members of the Piatt County Democrat Party. They were followed by Mr. L.J. Weidenbach in a decorated hupmobile carrying all 4 Republicans. The Oddfellows drum and bugle corps followed. On their heels, mounted, trotted the Anti-Horse Thief Society members, done up as old-time bounty hunters in big hats and drooping mustaches. Then came the first float. Mrs. L.J. Weidenbach had outdone herself, aided by a club she belonged to, the Order of the Eastern Star. Their float was a flatbed International Harvester truck banked in flowers. In a kitchen chair sat Mrs. Weidenbach's old daddy in full Civil War blue and his decoration from the Grand Army of the Republic. He seemed to have no idea of where he was. Surrounding him on the flatbed were the Eastern Star ladies garbed up in Grecian drapings. Mrs. L.J. Weidenbach was there too, in a vast hoop skirt holding her daddy upright. Above him, a sign roped in amber roses read, "Oldest settler in the community, born 1845, decorated veteran of the Civil War." By rights, this float should have been followed by a marching platoon from the Women's Christian Temperance Union carrying their sign, "Strong drink is a mocker." But somehow our float cut in. It was another hay frame, but this one from the Cowgills Dairy Farm. Flanking it on foot were the Cowgills brothers, who had all grown up to be good Christian men, except for Ernie, who was in jail. The horse that pulled our hay frame was the one that usually pulled the Cowgills milk wagon. It had its work cut out for it because there was a lot happening on our float. At the front was a sweating yellow mound that had been a cow carved out of butter before the sun got to it. Nearby stood Mary Alice in her ball gown, bowing to the crowd and holding up the loving cup for first prize in the talent show. I rode up with her wearing Grandpa Dowdel's wedding suit because Ray wouldn't ride on the float. Behind us sat Miss Effie Wilcox on a three-legged stool. She was demonstrating the use of a Pioneer butter churn. Her eyes roamed all over the crowds beside the street. At the back of the float was a throne, though it was only the platform rocker from Grandma's front room. On a pile of pillows to give him stature sat Uncle Grady Griswold in full uniform. The sun sparkled off the tip of his sword that he held aloft. He could no more raise a beard than I could, so he looked like a beaming boy. To lend him support, Grandma stood beside him, her feet planted wide. She was another Grandma, one we had never seen before. Her costume was an enormous and complicated old-fashioned gown made out of cut velvet and fringe. Its bustle overhung the rear of the hay frame, and in front it scooped breathtakingly low on her bosom. She topped herself with Adela Eubank's sunbonnet. Loose in her hand hung Grandpa Dowdel's 12-gauge Winchester. After all, it was an antique. Above them hung a sign, a sheet stretched between clothesline poles. It had taken me half the night to letter it. Uncle Grady Griswold, born 1832 and winged in the Mexican War, by far the oldest settler in the community. Just the sight of Grandma herself silenced the crowds. But by the time we were trundling past the Coffee Pot Cafe and Uncle Grady was brandishing his sword, the applause began. Into Mary Alice's ear I muttered, "But why Ray Veach?" "I saw possibilities in him," she said coolly, showing off her loving cup to the crowds. "I didn't know he could dance." "Dance?" Mary Alice sniffed. "He can barely walk. What do you think I've been doing all week? I've been giving him ballroom dancing lessons, and the big clodhopper tramped all over my feet. I'm crippled for life." The route of the parade crossed the Wabash tracks at the depot to give the other side of town a look. But the Bluebird train pulled in from Chicago right on schedule. It blocked the way and separated the parade just ahead of the Weidenbach float, which drew up short. The Cowgill's overworked old horse, dragging our hay frame, didn't notice. It clopped on and ran into Mrs. Weidenbach's float. We bumped. I reached for Mary Alice to keep her from tangling in her skirts and pitching off the float. Mrs. Wilcox teetered on her stool. Of course, Mrs. Weidenbach knew we were right behind her, crabbing her act with an older settler than her daddy. And her reciting nephew had finished out of the money at the talent show, so she was already upset and had her feed with us. But now her old daddy turned around and looked back. He may not have known where he was, but there was nothing wrong with his eyesight. He read our sign over Uncle Grady, and his old pink eyes narrowed. He spoke sharply to his daughter, who laid a restraining hand on him. Then it all happened quick. Miss Weidenbach's daddy slipped free of her, leapt out of his kitchen chair, and jumped off their float. He cocked his forage cap at a dangerous angle and stalked back to our hay frame. Glaring up at Uncle Grady, he howled, "You yellow-bellied old buzzard! If you fought in the Mexican War, we would have lost!" Seeming to consider this, Uncle Grady gazed down. Then he hollered, "Them's fighting words, and I declare war!" Before Grandma could stop him, he charged off his throne, balanced a moment at the edge of our float, and threw himself into space. He lit on Mrs. Weidenbach's daddy, and they both rolled in the street, locked in combat. Their medals and weaponry clanged like wild bells ringing out. "Don't use the sword, Uncle Grady," Grandma called. By now, the Wabash Bluebird should have pulled out, but all the passengers were at the windows staring at this spectacle. Two of the oldest men alive were brawling in the street, tangled up in each other and Uncle Grady's sword, their small fists throwing punches. Now they were so covered in dust and droppings you couldn't tell one uniform from the other. In the distance, from the other side of town, the last of the high school bands blared, "The Stars and Stripes Forever." At length, Miss Weidenbach separated the two old warriors, though her hoop skirt got in the way. Grandma would have let them fight it out. She came to the depot to see us off the day we left. It was to be our last visit together, and I suppose she knew. But she didn't say so. As the Bluebird appeared down the tracks, I had something to ask her. "Grandma, there's a loose end on my mind." Well, don't trip over it, she said. How did you know that Uncle Grady Griswold is 103 years old? How do you know he's not? She held up her spidery old black umbrella between herself and the sun. What I mean is, did he have a birth certificate or something like that? Birth certificate? Psh, they didn't have birth certificate in them days. You were just born, and people accepted it. By now, the train was pulling in, hissing steam, so that was her last word. As Mary Alice and I scrambled aboard, Grandma heaved up a picnic hamper to us. We were hardly out of town before we both slumped half asleep into the seat. A trip to Grandma really took it out of you. Dozing, I heard a mew. I looked down at our feet to see the lid rising in the picnic hamper. 2 green eyes poked out. I shot a look at Mary Alice, who was only pretending to be asleep. What's that? She blinked in surprise at the green eyes blinking back. For heaven's sakes, she said. It's the kitten. Poor little thing. It took her 3 days to find her way back from Uncle Grady's to the cob house. Grandma must have stuck it in the hamper, meaning for me to have her. What a surprise. And yet you don't look too surprised. You could knock me over with a feather, Mary Alice sniffed and lifted the kitten into her lap. How do you know Mother's going to let you keep a kitten? How do you know she's not? Said Mary Alice. And we steamed on, riding the Wabash Bluebird, bound for Chicago, across the patchwork fields. Chapter 8. The Troop Train, 1942. The years went by, and Mary Alice and I grew up, slower than we wanted to, faster than we realized. Another war came, World War II, and I wanted to get in on it. The war looked like my chance to realize my old dream of flying. My soul began to swoop as it had all those years ago at the county fair, when I had my first ride in Barnaby Buchanan's biplane. I only hoped the war would last long enough to make a flyer out of me. And so it did. I joined up at Fort Sheridan for the Army Air Corps. But before I could go to flight school, I had to do basic training down at Camp Leonard Wood. On the night we were shipping out from Dearborn Station, it occurred to me that the troop train would pass through Grandma's town sometime in the night. I sent her a telegram. She never did have a phone. A telegram might give her a turn, but I wanted to tell her the train would be going through town, though it wouldn't stop. In the way of troop trains, we left an hour late and sat on the siding outside Joliet for another hour. You didn't get any sleep on a troop train. Our car was blue with smoke and noisy with floating crap game. I sat through the long night, propped at the window. Then I knew we were getting to Grandma's town. It was sound asleep in the hour before dawn. We slowed past the depot, and now we were coming to Grandma's, the last house in town. It was lit up like a jack-o'-lantern. Every window upstairs and down blazed, though she always turned the light out when she left her room. Now we were rolling past, and there was Grandma herself. She stood at her door, large as life, larger, framed against the light from her front room. Grandma was there, watching through the watchless night for the train to pass through. She couldn't know what car I was in, but her hand was up, and she was waving big at all the cars, hoping I'd see. And I waved back. I waved a long time. I waved long after the window filled with darkness and long into the distance. Whew, that last part gets me. I loved this book. I love its historical value, talking about some of the feelings that people had during the Great Depression and some of the feelings of young kids growing up in a big city, going back to visit their grandma in a small town. At first, it was a real challenge for them. They didn't love being there with all the city stuff that they're used to, but they really grew to treasure their Grandma Dowdel. If there's one thing I've learned in life, we have people in our lives, family members, that have so much to teach us and so much love to give, even if it's a way that's different than what we're used to. It reminds me of my grandpa that would come every summer. He never told us he loved us, but he always shared a great love and a learning for us. He always tried to teach us some of the things that he knew, his wisdom. And it wasn't until later in life how much I realized I learned and how much I loved him, just like Joey and Mary Alice felt about their Grandma Dowdel. How beautiful for them to realize through her actions and her lessons and her final wave goodbye how much she truly treasured her grandkids. I hope you see that in your families. I hope you open your eyes to look at ways that people are trying to show you love, to teach you lessons, and to help you grow into the person you are meant to become. Always look for the good in the world, look for the good in people. And if you have trouble finding it, create a little yourself. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time. On the first, we're going to do horrible. I'm bringing it back. Oh, take it away. War would last long enough. I'm so worried I was going to make a mistake. I cut myself off when I didn't. But I made it almost through a whole page without messing up. Glory. Hallelujah. So talk amongst yourselves. Ooh. Ooh, wee. Totally reminds me of my grandpa Patterson. He loved us so much. And I didn't realize until I became an adult and drove my kids across the country to go visit my family and to know their grandparents and their aunts and uncles, what a sacrifice that was for him. You know, like by himself, he drove that trailer and we never knew how long he was going to stay. It's like we'd wake up one morning and he was just gone. And that was just how Grandpa did things. But I connected with him. I loved him something fierce. And it's really neat to me that through stories and pictures and stuff, that Trevor feels a connection to him that way too. I love my family. And I love my mom sitting there telling me how she loves me reading this because it brings her back to so many memories of her childhood. You know? How'd you like that ending, huh? The end.